Hello and welcome to this edition of Consciousness Raising Online. And I'm going to jump into this quickly because there's a lot of information I want to try and share today. No, I'm not going to try, I'm going to do it. But let me, of course, say thank you and welcome to the folks who are here with me live. Um, I can't see in real time uh, your comments if you're not at the website where we do this. So if you're watching this, for an example, on YouTube live, I'll see your comments later. But the only comments I can see as we're doing it live is at desty.com. All right. But I appreciate you, especially I believe it's Melanated One, who is going to be a regular, and I appreciate you. And of course, Miss Drea and Clyde and Shaka 64 and the others who joined me live. Thank you. Um, the reason why I've called this, named it the way I have, Above Ground Highway, the true story of the Underground Railroad, Drapetomania, and the Fugitive Slave Act. I did that because there's a lot of mythology and in some cases misinformation about the Underground Railroad. And I wanted to clear up some of it, or at least add some information. Okay, I guess I'm back on again. It dropped out for a minute. I hope it didn't do it where you are. All right, but here's the deal. The reason why I wanted to do this is because I believe that we need to know about the Underground Railroad in terms of what it really was, and especially in terms of how much organization went into it. Necessary. Um, slavery. Slavery was a terrible, 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 terrible thing. The slave trades were terrible. What was done to African people was outrageously terrible. And slavery, chattel slavery in the United States, was terrible. There's no other way to put it. It was terrible. It was obscene. And so, any human beings, in my opinion, would have been totally righteous to fight it, to try to escape from it, to do everything in their power to get out from under it. And you have to understand, we need to look at this, that it was um, over 200 something years that it was direct slavery, and then we went through 200 more years of more stuff. And so it was a terrible, terrible thing. Men were hung from trees and left for buzzards and crows. Now, these are people who tried to escape, okay? Women were carved open to the bones with cat o' nine tails. Bodies, alive and dead, were roasted on fires. Feet were cut off to prevent escapes, hands cut off. There was torture, there was rape, there was everything you can think of done to black people, to African people, to enslave them and keep them enslaved. Um, hmm. A slave who escaped and made it about 20 miles before being hunted down is whipped for the entertainment of guests, men and women, of the plantation owner before being castrated, doused with oil, and set on fire. These are the kind of things that they did for entertainment. And then you had a dude, and I gotta mention this, I'll mention this here. There was a dude, um, 10 years before the Civil War, which would have been 1853, 1850-ish. There was a series of articles entitled Diseases and Peculiarities of the Negro Race. This was to give direct and practical bearing upon the 3 million people who were at that time enslaved in the United States. And the value of those people in terms of property at that time was over $2 billion. There was a so-called distinguished New Orleans physician named Samuel Adolphus Cartwright, who described in precise anatomical terms the reason for black people's supposed laziness. He said there was deficiency of red blood in the pulmonary and arterial systems, a love of dancing, which he said profuse distribution of nervous matter to the stomach, liver, and genital organs, and exceptional dislike of being whipped. He said skin as sensitive when they are in perfect health as that of children. But one of the primary things that he was pushing was what he called a medical condition called drapetomania, which he said was the disease causing Negroes to run away. Let me say it again, because I know some people have heard of this, but you need to understand this was a alleged doctor who was writing and talking about this alleged disease, drapetomania. It was a disease causing Negroes to run away. And he said this affliction had 2 effective cures: treating one's slaves kindly but firmly, and if that didn't work, whipping the devil out of them. Now, I don't know about you, but if all of this stuff was happening, and then they had so-called doctors and scientists claiming that we had a disease if we wanted to run away, all I know is I'd be running away again and again until I got it done. So now, afterwards, after slavery, we believe that it was found out that there was a so-called Underground Railroad. And this Underground Railroad was supposed to be a clandestine organization of abolitionists, and some history said many of them were Quakers, and they used covert methods, tunnels, trapdoors, concealed passageways, and secret signals to help convey enslaved Africans to freedom. Let me get into some of the things that are true and not true. One, it is true that there were quite a few white people who were part of the Underground Railroad, and yes, some of them were Quakers. But here's what I want you to understand: it was actually a very organized but decentralized process of enslaved Africans getting to freedom. It was not an underground railroad. It wasn't underground in the sense that the entire process was not underground. It was actually above ground and in many areas right out front. It wasn't hidden at all. Now you say, well, how could that be? Well, I'm gonna break it down how that could be. We need to understand that yes, there were places where people were hidden out and all of that, sometimes in tunnels and under houses and all kinds of things. But the above ground highway, that's what I call it, the above ground highway was all over. It was all over. It was everywhere. Now, what you're seeing now are some graphics of some of the maps that show the routes supposedly of the Underground Railroad. And one of the things that I don't want you to get from these maps is the idea that it was organized in the sense that there were like signs and stuff. Here's a route to the Underground Railroad. No. Think of it like this: every single road, pathway, trail possible, the enslaved Africans used to get away from their plantation and from their owners. And this happened from the beginning almost of chattel slavery in the United States to the end. In other words, just as there were rebellions going on here and there, everywhere, all during slavery, there was always Africans trying to get away. Think about that again, what I just said. Every road, pathway, trailway, if it was going somewhere away from the plantation, slaves was taking it. Mostly at night, but sometimes they went in the day. They were always trying to escape. So that's what I need for you to understand. It was that widespread. It wasn't just some kind of organized little thing. And yes, so, and we'll talk about Harriet Tubman in a minute, because she was doing what she was doing, but she wasn't the only one. And what she was doing was what a whole lot of folks were doing. They was getting up out of there. There were people like William Steele and William Lambert and George de Baptiste, Levi Coffin, Thomas Garrett, Calvin Fairbank, Charles Torrey, William Lloyd Garrison. I say their names because these are heroes in terms of the process of helping Africans, enslaved Africans, get away. And they didn't just go to Canada. They went everywhere they could go. They went to Mexico. They went everywhere to get away. Okay? And hey, Shaka 64, if I'm coming through clearly, put a 1 in the box there, because I'm seeing that there might be some slight interruptions sometimes. And it might be because there's storms here in Chicago when I'm doing this. And it also might be because the forces that we talk about don't like this subject. Hey, Miss Drea. So understand what was going on with the Underground Railroad process. That's why I call it above ground highway. Black people rebelled and black people escaped. Now, one of the interesting things is that during the time period between 1838 and 1860, 95% of the enslaved Africans who fled went alone or with one other person. They did have sometimes families that would go, but most of the time it wasn't. And the majority of people who escaped were young African males in their teens and 20s who would escape on their own. In fact, in actuality, Harriet Tubman, most of the people that went with her when she would go, they were young black males. So if you understand that this process was going on, that these Africans was getting it. And so what the government had to do, um, the government going back to 1793, actually it was in the Constitution, but one of the things that it was in the Constitution that um, slaves had to be returned to their owners. That didn't stop it though. And so in 1793, there was the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. Keep this date in mind, where the Fugitive Slave Act, which was added to add more teeth to the Fugitive Slave Clause of the U.S. Constitution, it guaranteed the right of a slaveholder to recover an escaped slave. Now, one of the things that did was it put fugitives. The other thing that it did, it classified children born to fugitive slave mothers as slaves and the property of their mother's master for the rest of their lives. You see how they set that up? So if a slave owner raped a black woman and impregnated her, and she bore that child, then that child belonged to the owner of the mother for life. For life. Now that was the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. And they did that because this enslaved Africans kept escaping any kind of way they could. Okay? And again, now the majority, understand this, the majority of people who helped the escaping Africans, the majority of them were other black people. Now, yes, there were whites who helped in many ways, and there was quite a few, but the majority were black people. See, they got this thing going on now where they got these exhibits and these historical looks, and they're trying to say that it was a majority white people. No, it was not a majority. It was a lot, but the majority were black people. Free black people who risked their lives and their livelihoods to help Africans escaping. And why that's important to understand is that it goes against one of the mythologies that, oh, light-skinned Africans didn't help the dark skins and all that. No, Africans who were light, who were dark, who were whatever, if they were free, they helped escaping Africans. Okay? But they didn't, in most cases, they didn't go around talking about it, although there were some that did. They were very public about it. And I'll talk about them in a minute, because that'll surprise you how some were straight up, out loud saying, we help escaping slaves. Believe it or not, they were that bold. Okay? But I got to mention the second thing about the Fugitive Slave Act, because this is part of why it got so wild. And when I say wild, it was wild. Many northern states disregarded the 1793 Fugitive Slave Act. Um, in some places, they passed personal liberty laws, meaning that a jury trial had to be set up before alleged fugitive slaves could be moved. And the thing about what's going on today, see, anybody, any white man could claim that somebody was a fugitive slave. And in many cases, if they didn't have these laws set up, they could be snatched away. You know. So some areas they said, wait, first of all, person, we got to have a jury trial to determine whether this person is really a fugitive slave. Some areas refused to allow these alleged fugitive slaves to be put in local jails. In some places, the assistance of state officials in the arrest or return of alleged fugitive slaves was forbidden. Okay? Um, Now that sounds like what's going on today with the so-called illegal immigrants, don't it? So in other words, there were people who fought against this that knew it was wrong. And like I say, in quite a few were white, but of course the black folks definitely, because one of the things that could happen to black folks, even if they were so-called free, they had bounty hunters and stuff like that who would be snatching them and taking them and selling them, or this is where the phrase came from, sold down the river. Just like in the movie and, 12 Years a Slave, okay? That happened a lot. That wasn't no isolated case. That happened a lot. Black folks had to be careful about everything, just like we have to be careful today. All right? So now, um, Missouri. Missouri was one of the states that was was ornery. they Missouri was one of those states where if a slave got there, if a slave owner brought his slave to Missouri and that slave got away from the slave master, they could stay there in Missouri and certain other states. If they got away, they could stay there. They got their freedom. But now you had what you call the slave catchers, which are bounty hunters, as well as the unscrupulous ones. And so the government, in order to deal with the fact that nothing they could do would slow down the escaping slaves, they passed another Fugitive Slave Act in 1850. And this one, what they added to it, among other things, was that it said that not only did law enforcement have to capture fugitive slaves or runaway slaves, it said that the citizens had to do it. So now they're saying everybody had to, by law, help capture and turn in runaway slaves. Yeah. That meant not only in the slave states, but in the free states too. They had to help them capture slaves. Now, you know that didn't go for very well. And what happened was that they used to call that one, the abolitionists called that the bloodhound law, because of course the slave catchers and the kidnappers, they would use them bloodhounds to track down runaway slaves. And actually they used the dogs to track down anybody black. Because sometimes if they caught somebody and they needed to make they trying to make that money. So if they caught a black person Even if they had papers, what would they do? Tear up the papers and sell them down the river. They didn't care. And this expanded greatly the whole thing of bounty hunters. It made a huge industry because now what you're seeing is this: all black people were at risk, free or slaves, free or enslaved, all of them. So that's what I want you to understand about the atmosphere, the environment, was that whether it was free states or slave states,